Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling something really fundamental, It's about innovation, global leadership. Basically, the future of science and tech funding in the U.S. For a long time, America's been, well, the place to be, a magnet for the best minds. But that might be changing. And the reasons why? Well, that's where things get really interesting. Lots of debate there. So, the core of our deep dive today is kind of an intellectual sparring match. Two really compelling but very different takes on what's going on and what it means.
That's right. And to get our heads around this, we're looking at two key sources. First up, there's a Wall Street Journal piece from July 11th, 2025. Christopher Mims wrote it. It's called America's Brain Drain Could Become the World's Brain Gain. Pretty provocative title. Sets off alarm bells, really. Then, countering that, we've got a policy brief from the same month. It's titled Reframing the Science Budget Cuts, a Legitimate Reassessment, Not a War on Knowledge. That one's by Dr. Lev Neymotin from N5 Digital Inc., and it offers, well, a very structured counterpoint.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Our mission today is to explore both sides, look at their evidence, and figure out what this whole debate actually means for the U.S.'s place in the world. And, for you, trying to understand the bigger picture. So let's start with that alarm bell. The Wall Street Journal perspective. What's the core of this brain drain warning?
Well, Mims' argument in the WSJ is pretty stark. He's saying that these dramatic cuts in federal research funding, plus the changes we're seeing in skilled worker immigration policy, they're hitting one of America's biggest strengths. He calls it people-powered innovation. And his big warning is, look, if the U.S. keeps this up, the rest of the world, they stand to gain big time from the talent the U.S. is pushing away.
Right. And we need that context because the U.S. was the leader for so long. The article points this out clearly. Since the end of World War II, federal funding helped U.S. companies dominate. Computing, space, medicine.
Yeah.
It gave the whole country this economic tailwind.
Exactly. It made the U.S. this, essential destination.
But Mims just says flat out, now that's changing quickly.
Yeah, and the evidence he points to is, well, it's concerning. He mentions a survey in the journal Nature from March 2025. They talked to over 1,600 scientists in the U.S., and guess what? 3/4 said they've considered leaving the country.
3/4? Wow.
Yeah. And they specifically mentioned the Trump administration's hostility to scientific research as a key reason. Plus, it's hitting talent retention hard. It used to be that about 3/4 of international students who got a PhD here stayed long-term.
Okay.
Now, it's down to around 40%. Only 40% stick around long-term after getting their degree. That's a massive drop in, really critical talent.
When you hear numbers like that, yeah, it makes total sense why someone like Frances Arnold, Nobel Prize winner, chemical engineering prof, why she's quoted saying, "At stake today is our position as a worldwide beacon for brilliant minds." Rare warning is pretty blunt. The loss of R&D funding and exclusionary immigration policies will have ripple effects for decades. It's not just a blip.
And the economic hit, also pretty sobering. Mims cites analysis from American university economists. They figured a 25% cut in public R&D spending, eventually. It could shrink the nation's GDP by 3.8% a year.
3.8%. How does that compare?
They compare it directly to the hit we took during the Great Recession of 2007-09. So it's significant. And these aren't just abstract numbers. The National Institutes of Health, the NIH, facing a 40% cut. That's $18 billion.
Wow.
The National Science Foundation, NSF, cut by over half, about $5 billion. They estimate that wipes out support for like 78% of the early career researchers they usually back.
78%. That's devastating for young scientists.
It is. Even NASA's science mission budget is cut almost in half, a $3.4 billion loss. The article shows these cuts hitting agency after agency.
But it's interesting, the WSJ piece does include a counter voice from the administration. Michael Kratsios, Trump's science advisor, he's quoted calling the cuts a moment of clarity. He argues the scientific community delivered diminishing returns since the 80s and that political biases have displaced the vital search for truth.
Right. That quote actually becomes pretty important later when we look at the other source.
Okay.
But yeah, beyond the budget cuts, the article stresses the U.S. is also doubling down on policies, making it harder for skilled immigrants. Things like cutting H-1B visas. Yeah. Those are key for tech companies, right? And changes to optional practical training, the OPT program, which lets international students work here after they graduate.
So closing off pathways for talent.
Exactly. And that's a big deal because, historically, immigrants have been this huge innovation engine. Mims reminds us. Google, Amazon, Moderna, founded by immigrants or their kids. Nearly half of all Fortune 500 companies, actually.
That's incredible, half.
Yeah. So while the U.S. is doing this, other countries are jumping in. Mims describes German reps at a Nobel meeting literally handing out pamphlets to attract researchers, talking up their welcoming climate. Canada, the UK, China, the EU, they're all rolling out programs to lure U.S.-based researchers. They see it as their chance for a brain gain.
And the WSJ makes us feel very real with anecdotes, right? The stories from researchers.
Yeah, unnamed researchers and engineers, they're afraid of repercussions, understandably. But they talk about feeling forced out, their research funding disappearing, the politics getting too polarized and threatening, just finding it harder and harder to do their jobs. Even things like getting approval to attend international conferences became a hassle. It's personal.
That really hits home.
And you see companies adapting too. They're kind of dodging, as Mims puts it, the U.S. immigration issues by just setting up shop where the talent is.
Yeah, okay.
This really picked up speed during the pandemic, but look, Amazon's biggest office, not Seattle, it's Hyderabad, India, opened back in 2019. NVIDIA just opened a controversial research center in Shanghai. Microsoft has a huge new campus in India. Google's biggest office outside the U.S. Also Hyderabad.
So the talent's moving, and the big companies are following.
Pretty much. It's a clear trend.
Which brings us back to Frances Arnold's final warning in the WSJ piece. It really sums up the stakes. She says, many of our great companies will not be able to find the science workers, the startup companies will not be created, and we will not have the people we need to teach the next generation, or even inform the government and defense agencies. That's quite a dire prediction. But hold on. Just when that picture seems bleak and, frankly, pretty clear, this other perspective comes along, a really different narrative. Let's pivot now to Dr. Lev Neymotin's policy brief. It completely reframes these cuts, right? It pushes back hard against that simple brain drain idea.
It absolutely does. Dr. Neymotin's core argument, it challenges the whole premise. He suggests that being skeptical of federal science funding isn't automatically anti-science. He says it can be a rational, principled response to real, long-standing concerns. Things like institutional bias, inefficiency, a disconnect from public value.
Okay, so not scientific hostility.
Right. He frames it as democratic recalibration, not hostility, more like a course correction for science itself.
Right.
He's basically saying, hey, there might be good reasons for these changes, reasons that could actually make the system better in the long run.
So if the WSJ sees external threats causing a brain drain, Neymotin looks inward. He starts by questioning the culture within academia. What's his first point about ideological skepticism?
Yeah, his first big counterargument tackles this head on. He basically says, look, the criticism that academia often pushes liberal social agendas and shows an extreme imbalance politically, it has some merit. He cites faculty political ratios sometimes as high as 17-1 favoring progressives in certain fields.
17-1, okay.
And he points out that grant proposals are increasingly requiring things like DEI narratives, diversity, equity, and inclusion statements, and social impact justifications that he argues reflect a pretty narrow ideology. And here's where he connects back to that quote from Michael Kratsios in the WSJ, the one about political bias displacing the pursuit of truth. Neymotin says that statement deserves to be taken seriously. For him, this isn't being anti-science. It's a call to restore objectivity, open debate, maybe some intellectual humility within science.
That's a strong claim. Saying bias inside academia is justification for budget cuts. But isn't the worry that the cuts themselves are political, not about restoring objectivity? How does he square that circle?
Well, Neymotin would likely argue the cuts are a response to the politicization he sees within science. It's like a reaction meant to push science back towards objectivity, not an attack from outside. And his next point kind of supports this. He suggests a shift in what kind of research gets prioritized, moving away a bit from purely basic research.
Okay, applied versus basic research. What's the argument there?
He argues that while basic research, driven by pure curiosity, finding out how things work fundamentally is foundational, its marginal returns have declined. Meaning it now takes exponentially more resources to generate incremental progress. He feels a lot of projects end up being highly speculative, obscure, or disconnected from pressing national needs.
So diminishing returns on purely theoretical stuff?
Kind of. So he advocates shifting more funding towards applied, translational, and mission-driven research. Stuff that leads more directly to products, solutions. Especially in areas like defense, AI, semiconductors, biomanufacturing. He sees that as offering more tangible near-term benefits and calls it a rational response to economic and geopolitical imperatives.
This next argument taps into a bigger political philosophy, right? About the size and role of government.
Absolutely. Neymotin sees the current scale of federal science funding as a product of mid-20th century expansionism, not something constitutionally required. He points to an earlier model where science thrived more through private patronage, state universities, and market forces. He suggests moving back towards that aligns with limiting federal power.
Or bureaucracy?
Yeah. He argues the big science agencies, NIH, NSF, suffer from bureaucratic bloat, opaque overhead structures, and compliance burdens. Lots of red tape. So for him, the cuts actually introduce discipline and force prioritization. They push towards leaner, more agile models, competitive grants, state consortia, maybe private-public partnerships.
Okay, so a shop to force efficiency.
Yeah.
But the brain drain folks would say you're not trimming fat, you're cutting bone and muscle, right? Destroying capacity. Does he address that risk?
He doesn't frame it as destruction so much as necessary disruption. A disruptive intervention, he calls it, to realign a system he sees as already inefficient. Which leads to his next point about how science is perceived by the public, the cultural signaling.
Right. How science communicates with society.
Neymotin expresses concern here. When research institutions embrace what he calls activist frameworks, he mentions things like decolonizing STEM or embedding identity politics into core science. He thinks policymakers might reasonably see that as ideological capture. Ideological capture.
Yeah. And in that context, budget cuts then become a message, he argues, a message to refocus on universal knowledge, merit, national priorities. It's about recalibrating science's cultural posture so it serves and is trusted by all Americans.
Okay, beyond the philosophy, there's the hard reality of the national debt. That plays a role too, presumably.
Oh, definitely. He puts it squarely in the context of fiscal reckoning. We're talking over $34 trillion in national debt, rising interest payments. In that situation, he argues, discretionary programs like NSF, NIH, NASA Science, they're some of the few places where actual cuts can be made without causing, immediate legal or humanitarian crises, especially since, as he argued before, many funded projects offer slow, speculative returns. So it's partly just budget reality driving hard choices. And his next point hits on something that affects how everyone, especially outside academia, sees science. Communication gaps.
Right. Neymotin suggests that a lot of Americans feel kind of alienated by the language, the values, the sheer inaccessibility of the scientific elite, as he puts it. Think about abstract project titles, results hidden behind paywalls so the public can't read them, institutional language tied to niche political causes. He says this stuff erodes trust.
Makes sense.
So for Neymotin, budget cuts might even serve as a signal to reconnect, a wake-up call for science to, explain itself better, engage more, rebuild credibility with people outside the academic bubble.
Now, this final point he makes, this is really interesting. It tackles the brain drain idea directly, but flips it completely.
Yeah, this is where his argument gets really provocative and offers that direct counter-narrative. He claims a major contributor to the so-called brain drain, the very thing the WSG warns about, isn't actually the federal funding cuts themselves.
It's not the cuts. Then what is it?
It's the internal allocation and administration of that funding within universities and institutions.
The overhead.
Exactly. He says many institutions divert a huge chunk of grant money to indirect costs and administrative overhead. This leaves the actual researchers, the principal investigators, scrambling with insufficient funds to do the work. And that, he argues, forces many promising researchers to seek alternative employment or relocate abroad. It's an internal brain drain caused by the system itself.
Wow. Okay.
He also criticizes the calcified and opaque grant approval process. Says many scientists see it as driven by academic politics, favors, entrenched networks. Basically a patronage-like system that favors established players.
So the system itself is pushing people out, not just the lack of federal money.
That's his argument. If you connect the dots, Neymotin is saying a lot of what looks like a brain drain from the outside is actually a symptom of these deep internal problems, inefficiencies, biases, overhead within the institutions getting the money. So the budget cuts. He sees them, maybe counterintuitively, as that disruptive intervention, not to kill research, but to force a hard look at how it's supported, who really benefits, and if the system can become more transparent and performance-based. It totally shifts the blame, doesn't it?
It really does. From an external crisis caused by policy to an internal reckoning needed within science itself.
Yeah.
Okay, so putting these two very different, very passionate arguments side by side, what's the bottom line?
Well, the core disagreement is pretty clear, isn't it? The Wall Street Journal sees external threats, funding cuts, immigration policy causing a dangerous brain drain. Dr. Neymotin flips that. He reframes the cuts as a democratic recalibration, maybe even a necessary one, aimed at fixing internal problems within the scientific world, bias, inefficiency, priorities to create a more accountable, effective system overall.
So this raises a really important question for you listening. Why does this high-level debate matter? Why should you care about science funding fights and brain drain talk? What's the takeaway for your world?
Well, because it's not just about dollars or academic spats, right? This debate touches the future of the economy, innovation, America's influence globally, even fundamental public trust in science. Understanding both these perspectives helps you see the really complex dynamics at play between government policy, the culture inside academia, how talent moves around the world. It shows that things aren't always simple. There are often competing, deeply held reasons behind big shifts like this. It pushes you to look past the headlines.
Okay, so just to recap, we heard the brain drain alarm from the Wall Street Journal, worried about funding cuts, immigration changes, and other countries benefiting. And then we dove into Dr. Newmotin's counterargument, framing the cuts as a reassessment, a course correction, driven by concerns about ideology, efficiency, and internal institutional issues.
Yeah, and what's so striking is how one narrative points outward, external forces are causing a drain, while the other points inward, no, much of the drain is self-inflicted due to internal problems. And wait. It really changes the conversation. And maybe, as you think about all this, the key takeaway isn't just about the amount of federal money going into science. Maybe the bigger questions are about how that money is used, what values guide the research, and the culture within the institutions themselves.
Definitely something to chew on as you continue your own deep dives. We hope exploring these two sides has given you some new perspectives, maybe even challenged an assumption or two.